intersection. Okay, that's a good point. I'm going to introduce, we will have this session recorded. Thank you, Elissa. And please, I would ask you all to not share any part of this session outside of this recording. We will be sharing it later on social media, but for now, please don't share it outside. I would also remind everyone that if you need the translation for the interpretation, if you want to listen in Arabic or in English, you can press the Earth button down on the chat on the screen. It's called interpretation. There is this symbol of Earth. If you click on it, you can choose Arabic or English. بس بدي أذكر كل اللي موجودين وموجودات إذا حابين تستمعوا لهي السيشن باللغة العربية أو الإنجليزية ففيكم تضغطوا على إشارة الكرة الأرضية بالأسفل محطوط وبتختاروا من الانتربريتيشن لغة عربية أو إنجليزية. تمام. Okay, so I would like to welcome you all on this session. Please let me introduce first Women Now for Development, a locally embedded intersectional feminist network composed of 4 organizations led by Syrian women. We utilize participatory and transformative methods that empower women and girls on the ground in their leadership roles. We also contribute to building women-led feminist movements and enriching feminist knowledge production nationally, regionally, and globally to reach a more just and democratic society. In this event, we will showcase the effectiveness and impact of feminist crisis response as exemplified by Women Now for Development's earthquake response. We will present a case study on the response to the earthquake in Syria and Turkey, which captures the conceptualization of what is understood as compound crisis. What are building blocks for feminist response and main strategies from the perspective of frontline activists, women organization, and feminist funds? The learning process sought to understand and document what made its earthquake response feminist, how it shifted the organization's operations, people, and programming, and to engage with the question of what makes a humanitarian response feminist. At the end of this session, we will have a time for Q&A. Please, if you have a question at any time of the session, you can write it on the chat box and direct it to the person you want them to answer you at the end. We will choose some of the questions at the end based on also how much time is left. Please, if you have any question now, if anyone having any trouble or technical issues, please also write to us in the chat box. I would like to give the floor now to our long-term supporters and partners at the Swedish Embassy in Beirut and Kvinna. Both have believed in Women Now and trusted us to respond effectively by providing feminist flexible funding and creating a space to share, ask, and collaborate through past and current struggles. First, I would like to introduce Evelina Irstad, First Secretary at the Embassy of Sweden in Beirut. She's a program manager and gender specialist working with the implementation of Sweden's regional strategy for the Syria crisis. Evelina joined the embassy last year after working with the Swedish Strategy for Global Gender Equality, an important tool for the Swedish Development Cooperation to increase funding to women's rights organizations and feminist movement building. Please, Evelina, I would like you to start.
Thank you so much, Zaina. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. So my name is Evelina Irstad, and I represent the embassy, the Swedish Embassy in Beirut, as proud co-host of this event. I want to start with expressing my gratitude to Women Now for Development, your partners, and Kvinna for your critical work as defenders of women's rights and gender justice in Syria, in the region, and elsewhere. Thank you also for taking the initiative for this important conversation and for creating a space as part of the Brussels conference to reflect and learn from your humbling experience as frontline responders in emergencies and crises, an experience I know is shared by many parts of this digital space. We are living in a time of unprecedented humanitarian needs, with more people displaced by conflict, crisis, and the global climate emergency, requiring humanitarian assistance and protection than ever before. Crises are never gender neutral. They amplify gender injustice, they disrupt girls' education, exacerbate risk of all forms of gender-based violence, and shatter critical reproductive health services. But those worst affected by conflicts and natural disasters, and the civil society and community groups that work with them, are often the last ones consulted, enjoy the least amount of power, and seldom receive dedicated support to respond to their community's urgent needs. Feminist organizations are uniquely positioned to lead crisis response because of their long-term relationships with local communities and their ability to get resources to those who are often overlooked by mainstream response efforts, including LGBTQI plus people, people with disabilities, religious and ethnic minorities, displaced communities, and those living in remote locations, to mention a few. The exclusion from meaningful participation in the humanitarian architecture of locally based groups that represent communities facing multiple and intersecting forms of marginalization undermines their agency and the capacity within the humanitarian response to take into account diverse needs and effectively reach the people in most need. Sweden has a long-standing commitment to gender equality and the women's and girls' empowerment in development cooperation and in humanitarian assistance. There is a growing recognition of women's rights organizations and feminist movements as key stakeholders for the achievement for gender equality goals, the eradication of poverty, for peace, sustainable development, and for effective humanitarian response. This is acknowledged by our concrete instructions to contribute to enhancing the conditions for women's rights organizations, feminist movements, and women human rights defenders to act independently and to increase the safety and security for actors and organizations that promote gender equality and women's and girls' rights. Supporting women's collective power is, together with and complementary to compulsory gender integration in all our contributions, central for advancing gender equality and social justice. Last year, 3.2% of the Swedish development aid channeled through the Swedish Agency for Development Cooperation were directly targeted towards women's rights organizations and movements at the front lines battling for justice and for their communities' rights and needs before, during, and after crises. Although still a low number, it is an increase from previous years and far above the 0.13% of the total official development assistance that goes to women's rights organizations. Today, we are gathered to learn from Women Now for Development and their partners' experience of responding to natural disasters and crises based on the feminist values that underpin their very existence, and to discuss how to address key gaps and challenges for women's rights and women-led organizations to shape emergency responses, ensuring a truly effective and inclusive response that centers the needs of those most affected. I am eager to listen and participate in this discussion and would like to again express my gratitude for the initiative for this important conversation and for all of you who have joined us today and showed interest in the issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelina. We really appreciate this long-term partnership together with you. I would like also to introduce our partners at Kvinna till Kvinna. Elissa Shamma. Elissa is a feminist and the program officer for Kvinna till Kvinna Syria's program, with over a decade of experience advocating for social justice and working on conflict in the global south. She now collaborates closely with women's rights organizations and groups to advance women's rights in Syria. Elissa is committed to feminist movement building, organizing, and shaping discourse. Elissa also is our dear friend. Please, Elissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zena. Thank you, everyone. Is my voice well heard? Great.
Yes.
I will be speaking in English as well today. And thank you to everyone who is attending this session on this Friday afternoon. And firstly, I want to reiterate as well what Evelina mentioned about expressing our gratitude to Women Now for this opportunity, and that together as well, we are emphasizing the critical need for feminist and flexible funding for women's rights organizations, especially in contexts like Syria. Just briefly, as Kvinna till Kvinna, we work directly in areas affected by war and conflict. Mainly to strengthen the influence and power of women. So in Syria, we've been working since 2009, and together with our partners on defending and advancing women's rights towards gender justice. So in our work modality, we focus on providing long-term organizational strengthening and flexible and trust-based funding to support the work of our partners. And because of the earthquake in 2023, our partners were yet again deeply affected by displacement, by destruction, burnout, and loss. And so although they were not humanitarian organizations, neither are we, they were yet again positioned as the first responders to their communities since they are present. They serve and work with their communities, and they have already established trust. So basically, we facilitated the response efforts through emergency funds, swift coordination, flexibility in rethinking program activities to address the new shocking reality, genuine care and empathy, check-ins with partners, support wellness practices, whether we're talking about reporting or timelines, or general commitment to mental health of communities and our partner staff. And yet we can do much more when we talk about such a context. In Syria, we must recognize the complexity of the crisis and the realities of gendered experiences of displacement and conflict. And thus addressing the multi-layered challenges that women and girls face in Syria demands comprehensive strategies that go beyond mere mitigation of immediate needs. And that is where the conversation that we are having here today about flexible and feminist funding for women's rights organizations comes in its significance, because such funding ensures that women's rights organizations can swiftly and effectively respond to evolving crises, to address the unique needs of women and girls impacted by violence, by displacement, by systemic discrimination. In the context of feminist crisis response, this approach not only promotes gender justice, but also empowers local women leaders to shape interventions that are relevant, that are sustainable, that foster resilience and long-term recovery of their communities. So as funders, we should be key resource allies in such responses. We should share the burden and risk of responding to a complex crisis. We should support self-led, rights-based work that link the short-term needs due to the crisis, but also looks ahead at the long-term changes of power imbalances. And each of us actors here today has a great role in shaping how our systems should better work to respond to the different realities and be better fit for purpose. So with this, I give it back to Zena, and thank you for the space. We look forward today to learn from Women Now and their partners and to have a meaningful discussion together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elissa. I would like to take the time now, and I'm going to introduce Lubna Al-Qanawati, co-director of Women Now. Lubna is a Syrian feminist and women's rights activist whose journey began in the early days of the Syrian revolution. Recognizing the dire conditions faced by women during the conflict, she took on the critical role of providing humanitarian aid in besieged areas. Throughout her journey, Lubna has been a tireless advocate against human rights abuses, documenting violations supporting fellow civilians, and advancing accountability for chemical weapons attacks on Syrian civilians while combating gender-based violence. Lubna, the floor is yours.
شكرا Kvinna. Thank you. I will speak in English also. Thank you everyone for being here. We really appreciate your time. It's still an emotional event to us, even that there's more than a year have passed for the disaster. But we know that these days the situation also in Northwest Syria is not the perfect one. I want to start first to say blessing and peace for all people who lost their life in the earthquake. We know that we lost a lot of friends, family members, and teammates also in other organizations. We've lost a lot as Syrian and also as Turkish, and the community didn't heal yet. So it's good to know that's what we are trying to do today, to keep saying that maybe the earthquake finished, but the impacts of the earthquake, it's still deep, affecting the communities and the people. I want to thank everyone here today, starting from our partner, Swedish Embassy, and also Kvinna, who've been with us in this organizing. I want to thank Women Now team, who play a very big role in organizing this event and also in responding to the disaster. Even that they have a very huge wounded, they try to carry on themselves and to respond to themselves, to their families, and also to the community that they exist. They try to heal, to find space. We are trying to heal and to find space to heal, but also we know that we are living in a very critical area of this world, and its disaster and crisis keep moving on and coming. So I want to really appreciate me being a part of this amazing team. Thank you very much. And thank you for all our partners from women-led groups and from women leaders who also put everything aside and just hurry to help anyone they find in front of them. They play a very big role in this response to the crisis, even that they've been themselves displaced several times, living maybe in poverty, in a very critical condition, political one and economical one, but they really did an amazing work. And we hope that they keep taking this space as they deserve it, to be in the front lines, not just in responding to disaster, but also in shifting and shaping the rules of women in the area and taking the lead in every details of the lives of Syrians. I'm not gonna make it so long. Today you are going to hear from amazing women that we have, starting from Kashi, Yamama, Bisan, and Dalal. I hope you will enjoy your time. I know enjoy is a very optimistic word, but I hope you will enjoy this time by knowing that we are trying to survive. We're still surviving and we keep trying every day. And this is really something we need to stand and appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time, and back to you, Zainab.
Thank you so much, Lubna. That was very touching, actually. I would like to say that through solidarity and feminist leadership, we have come to this point today, and we are like able to shift our tragedies into learning experiences. So thank you all. Following Lubna, I would like to introduce Cassie Denbo, who has put her experience and efforts into making this experience a written and learning document. Cassie is a facilitator, organizational strengthening, and feminist resource mobilization specialist with over a decade of experience working with gender justice, feminist and human rights organizations, donors, and movements. At the heart of her work is a commitment to ensuring our justice movements are sustained as abundantly as they sustain us. Cassie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zaina. And thank you for the warm introduction and also just for the trust to be part of this process. As Zaina mentioned, my name is Cassie, and I had the honor of facilitating and co-leading Women Now's learning process with my colleague at Women Now, Batul. And so I wanted to just quickly thank everybody on the Women Now team, the PSS providers, all of the partner organizations who took time and energy to speak with us as part of this process, and whose work and whose stories are the foundation of everything I'm going to be sharing today. And so my goal for my small part of today is to give you a brief overview of the learning paper and the process. Hopefully just enough to convince you to actually go read the entire paper if you haven't already. And at a minimum to check out the illustrated 4-page narrative summary if you don't have time for the full one. And I also am going to be setting a language foundation in terms of what we mean when we talk about a feminist crisis response, and also sharing some learnings from Women Now in the team. And finally, some practical recommendations for donors and for large NGOs looking to support this work. So if we can start sharing the slideshow, thank you so much. Perfect, and we can go to slide 2. Great, thank you. So I wanted to begin us with this quote. It is from a member of the Women Now EU team that helped to lead the response design and the coordination. And I think it's a really important quote because it captures the gravity of the impact of the earthquake and the impact of actually coordinating the response. So often when we talk about people responding to massive ruinous disasters, conflict and war, we have this tendency to deify them, to make them a hero, and to lift them up on a pedestal, talking about their resilience, their tenacity, and their strength. All of these things are true, but just as quickly as we give them our praise, they also deserve our time, our energy, and our resources. The earthquake that happened in Turkey and Syria is a natural disaster. The earthquake alone is outside of our control. But the impact of the earthquake, the inordinate burden that some people carried more than others, is human-made. The mix of a devastating natural disaster in a context with multiple ongoing overlapping crises was shattering across northwest Syria and southern Turkey. And the recovery is still in process, it still continues. However, a natural disaster worsened by war and conflict and deep structural inequity that prioritizes the lives and futures of some of us over all of us is not isolated to Syria alone. In 2023, Herat province in Afghanistan experienced multiple devastating earthquakes, and northeast Libya was inundated with severe flooding that killed thousands. All of these natural disasters further exacerbated through other structural inequities and infrastructure. Around the world, more and more communities are extremely vulnerable to uncontrollable natural disasters, worsened by economic and political instability and conflict, and exacerbated by the climate crisis. We must resource locally led feminist crises more holistically, and better yet, before there is a crisis. We must learn to move resources differently and ensure that the structure of our philanthropic and international assistance matches these goals. So if we can please move on to the next slide. Right. Okay, so I'm going to transition into a little bit about the actual process of this research. So this learning process took place between October 2023 and January 2024. During this time, the final stage of Women Now's crisis response, specifically their work with women-led initiatives in northwest Syria, was still very much underway. And over the course of the research process, we reviewed dozens of monitoring and evaluation documents and surveys that the Women Now team had conducted. We reviewed external definitions, best practices and approaches to feminist crisis response, as well as gender-sensitive humanitarian response to develop the framework of the analysis that we hold. We also had multiple rounds of focus group discussions with 46 people from 3 key actor groups. So this is the Women Now teams in EU, Syria, and Turkey. PSS providers who provided mental health support to the team, as well as the communities. And of course, to women-led initiatives across Northwest Syria. Finally, we surveyed 7 Women Now donors to understand how they think about feminist crisis response and gender-sensitive humanitarian response. And we also conducted an anonymous survey, which 19 members of the Women Now team completed to allow them to further build on what we discussed in our large group discussions. And so we had 3 main goals with the research we were trying to do. The first was to articulate the definition of a feminist crisis response and its distinctions, what makes it different than a normal humanitarian response. So the secondary goal was to document Women Now's approach to the response, its process, its effectiveness, and also its impact. And finally, it was to build space for processing and catharsis on the impact of running the response, and of course, the earthquake as well for the Women Now team. So to kick us off, and actually we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to begin with the definition that we created through this process of what counts as a feminist crisis response. And to give some context for where this definition comes from, it's really an amalgamation of a couple different sources of information. This is the words, the language, the framework we used is something that Batul and I synthesized from our observations as facilitators and researchers on this process, but it's drawn from conversations, quotes, ideas, experiences that come from the Women Now team in Syria, Turkey, and the EU, women-led initiatives that we spoke with, and also PSS providers. It further is contextualized and broadened through work that's already happening by feminist movement actors around the world, as well as donors. And so one of the defining features of a feminist response that I want to uplift here is that one of the distinctions is that feminist response has an eye on long-term social transformation. And this matters because it speaks to the reality that a feminist response holds many things at one time. It pays attention to and it accounts for the immediate emergency needs, but it also looks towards the future in a collective way. For Women Now for Development, this meant securing the safety of the team while also figuring out how to provide recovery resources to women-led initiatives in Northwest Syria to support and sustain their work. This happened through grants, technical support, cash assistance, and access to PSS services. And we can go on to the next slide as well. Thank you. Some other ways that that definition was lived in action in the Women Now response was thinking about the response as 3 overlapping phases, with each phase involving multiple stakeholders, accounting for multiple needs, and serving multiple goals. In addition, the emphasis on providing PSS support in both group and individual ways for all stakeholders at every stage is one of the ways that Women Now lived its commitment to collective care, as well as its feminist values to creating a feminist response approach that looked at securing the long-term stability and security of everyone involved. All right, and we can go on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the second goal of this research was to really look at the response itself, right? To look at what worked well, what needs refinement, what could maybe have been done differently in retrospect. So there were 5 guiding questions that we had for this phase of the research, but I'm only going to focus on 2 of them for today. So I'm going to talk about what could have been done better or differently, and I'm also going to look at the best measures that were taken to ensure that a feminist and gender-sensitive response was going on. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'll start with some reflection on what could have been done better or differently to enhance the impact of the feminist and gender-sensitive response. And I offer this with some real boundaries. I mean, it was an emergency. There was a real urgency to what was going on. And so there were structural barriers and limitations in terms of time and also in terms of access to resources that automatically kind of constrained what could happen in the response and when it needed to happen to respond to emergency needs. But a few things that in retrospect could have changed the response and the experience of doing the response are shown here. So to begin with, a pool of flexible funding that women now could have quickly reallocated to meet immediate response needs. So women now had some flexible resources available, and that was critical to how the response was done. However, significant time went into fundraising for the response, and that naturally slowed things down. Having a pool of resources at hand that could have supported a faster response, but it also would have supported a less arduous response experience for the team. It also would have helped from the very beginning to clarify what commitments women now had the capacity to make for their partners if they'd known how much money they were working with. Another key thing that could have been done differently is having a disaster and emergency plan in place in advance that the entire team was trained on. So Women Now has an emergency plan. This is a plan that's been developed over 12 years through their lived experience of operating and working and living through war and conflict. And this plan focuses on team safety and security. So there was already a framework that existed that Women Now was drawing from. However, this plan did not account for natural disasters of this scale, as well as the amplifying complexity that occurred around it. And so by having a plan that everyone was trained on, it could have simplified some of the initial coordination and allowed people to know how to adapt their role to step into this crisis role. Another kind of mechanical piece is an existing shared understanding across the whole team on the importance of meal. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Women Now conducted ongoing field visits and evaluations of all activities throughout the response. However, on reflecting on this experience, Women Now still saw a need and a desire to invest in the capacity across the entire organization to evaluate and reflect and build in feedback mechanisms about their work. In addition, a robust team wellness and care practice for, during, and after the response, more coordination opportunities for women-led initiatives to exchange skills, knowledge, and resources, and a pre-established system to rotate in volunteers and consultants to support the team when it was too exhausted. And just to say for this last one, the mechanics of this needs to be figured out. But one of the things we talked about is there were some daily functions of keeping an organization running that potentially could have been handed off to consultants, board members, people who know Women Now's work well, to allow people who were fundraising for the response, coordinating the response, planning the response, recovering themselves from the response to focus on what they were doing. But as I mentioned, this needs some more exploration in terms of implementation, but it was one of the ideas that we discussed. Right, so we can move on to the next slide, please. Right. So what were some of the best measures and actions taken? So one of the things that came up across all stakeholders, including when we spoke with donors through the survey, is that this response accounted for short-term, mid-term, and long-term recovery needs, as well as just structures. In addition, the fact that there was ongoing evaluations that was happening on the different aspects of the response was hugely helpful in terms of response design. In a couple of instances, in the delivery of the emergency kits that were handed out to women and girls and families at internally displaced persons camps, the team learned that the actual delivery of the kits were taking too long and adding additional stress. Having this information allowed that process to be refined for the next time the kits were given out, allowing people who received the kits to have a better experience in accessing them and reducing the time it took to actually give the kits out. Another thing that went really well was caring for the carers. So as Lubna mentioned and Zaina mentioned, the Women Now team itself was impacted by this earthquake. Over 90 team members and their families were directly impacted. And so the first thing that needed to happen was to make sure that the team and their families were safe and in a place where they were able to stabilize their own lives. By focusing on this, Women Now was able to then look outwards sustainably, ensuring that its own team was cared for and that it had the capacity and the ability to do the other phases of the response that it wanted to run. And then finally, this internal learning process that Batul and Lubna and the Women Now team conceptualized was another measure that people showed a lot of appreciation for, the ability to kind of, even though the response was ongoing, to look back on it, to reflect together as a group as well as individually was something that there was appreciation for. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so finally, and I won't spend too much time on this today for the sake of time, but one of the goals was to build space for intentional processing and catharsis. And so this goal really informed how Batul and I thought about structuring focus group discussions, the kind of conversations we had, the research avenues that we created, so that this could be a process that, of course, fed learning, but also fed people that were part of the response as well. All right, and we can go on to the next one. And sorry, we can move forward from this one, actually. Perfect. All right. So I'm going to wrap up my time with you today by talking about some recommendations for donors that come from Women Now's experience administering this response and also fundraising for it. I just want to acknowledge, like the donors who were sharing, who were co-hosting this space with today, we had some really incredible donors who demonstrated with their money, with their processes, and their support what a true commitment to supporting feminist movements looks like in practice. And so just really a lot of gratitude and thanks for that. However, there are still things that could have been done differently, and there are still asks that we do have for the donor community and our resource movement architecture more broadly. A lot of what we have here, I also want to acknowledge the ongoing advocacy efforts of feminist organizations and the feminist movement around the world, because it really is informed by these ongoing calls that have been happening for decades, that we need a money movement architecture that is rooted in solidarity, that is rooted in risk sharing, and moves more and better money to locally led groups. As one of the donors explained during their response to the donor survey, donors must fund grassroots and feminist initiatives that are frontline responders during natural disasters. Supporting these initiatives, rather than the large international organizations, ensure that resources are efficiently directed towards gender-sensitive and community-driven responses. So here are our calls for the donor community. The first is that we expand what counts as risk and we reevaluate risk thresholds. We share the risk of responding with partners. So I wanted to also just uplift, because I think often this idea of risk sharing can come up and it can feel like, okay, what does that look like in practice? I wanted to uplift the really incredible work of Mama Cash, Avid, and the Count Me In consortium that explores how bilateral and multilateral funders can resource movements differently and engage really deeply and very practically with this idea of risk. So for anyone who wants to kind of dive deeper into what adjusting risk and reevaluating your risk looks like in practice, that's a really important kind of ecosystem contribution to what that looks like. Another thing we ask of donors is to invest in training and emergency preparedness for all partners operating in complex crisis at the very beginning. And then we need to make sure we're funding these groups that are trained to implement and lead the work that they're trained to do and that they want to do. One of the stories that came up as we were doing this is that a number of INGO partners and donors, after the earthquake happened, shared resources on how to respond to an earthquake in a gender-sensitive way. Everybody recognizes that this was well-intentioned and that people were trying to be helpful. But the unfortunate reality is that it was too late to be helpful at that point. And therefore, now we knew that these resources existed and that technically groups could have had access to them, but at this stage in time, it was too late to do that synthesis. So just to say, we need to be doing this in advance, especially when the resources are there. In addition, we need to be funding organizational wellness practices, and we need to reflect a commitment to wellness in the reporting timelines and the grant processes that accompany the money that we're moving. So yeah, there. And the other part of this is that we need to resource the years after the crisis as willingly as the crisis is resourced. So again, we had amazing donors who showed up very quickly with flexible funding to make this response happen. And that's exactly what should happen, right? But now the crisis is quote unquote over, and we're not seeing the same level of commitment to supporting long-term rebuilding and community-led work in Northwest Syria, in Northern Syria more broadly, and in Southern Turkey. And this means that women-led initiatives and communities continue to remain vulnerable to future natural disasters, as well as other destabilizing actors, conflict, and the existing inequality that was there. A fifth call for donor is to really think about the ecosystem and the context in which partners operate in. So in this case, looking at Syrian groups that are in exile and understanding their role in the broader Syrian feminist movement, specifically the security and the strategic positioning they hold to help advance work. And finally, and this is a quite technical one, but it's something that we were quite eager to explore more, but didn't have the evidence around yet, which was to fund research that explores the relationship between feminist crisis response and the mitigation of sexual exploitation and violence. All right, and I have one last slide and I'm done. I wanted to leave you with this quote, which comes from a member of the team in Turkey and Syria during our focus group discussion. And what I really wanted to emphasize here is that funding and running a holistic, feminist, gender-sensitive crisis response benefits everybody. By focusing not just on what individuals need, but on what the community needs, and also what local organizations need, we are making investments in community agency, self-sufficiency, and self-held visions of the future. And this benefits all of us, no matter where we are. So I will stop there and I will pass this back to Zeina and the Women Now team. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Cassie. That was great. Actually, I would like to remind everyone that you can read the detailed paper on our website and also go back to the invitation. There is a direct link for the paper so you can read through it. And if you have any questions, you can always come back to us. Thank you so much, Cassie, for all of this. I know we needed like 2 more hours to explain, but it's we managed like our best. Okay, I would like to remind everyone to use the Q&A chat box to submit your questions, and we will answer some of them at the end of the session. I'm going to move now to the Turkey team, to Yamama. But first, I would like to let you know that usually when any crisis happen in Syria, the Turkey team are the first responders because of their geographical positioning. And however, this time they were directly affected, and the Europe team had to handle the situation from a distance. And it was really tough on all of us because as we work as a team in Syria and Turkey and Europe and everything, but this time it was really difficult on all of us. And bearing in mind that most of the Syrian women now are forcibly displaced many times and have gone through so many violations, so dealing with an earthquake was again something really, really tough. Let me introduce Yamama now. Yamama from Women Now Turkey. She's a Syrian woman, human rights advocate, and a researcher with a master's degree in political science and international relations. She has a strong background in supporting women-led initiatives and advocating for women's and human rights in crisis-affected areas. Experience in advocacy, program leadership, and project management. She's now serving as Deputy Director with Women Now Turkey. Currently, she oversees various programs focused on sustainable development, protection, and capacity building for women and girls in Northwest Syria. Yamama, the floor is yours.
شكرا زينة، شكرا للجميع لأمضي معكم أنا اليوم. أنا رح أحكي الجزء المترتب من عندي بالعربي، ورح أحكي تحديدا عن عملية الاستجابة كبراكتس يلي قمنا فيها بشكل مختصر، ولأني كنت كمان جزء من هاي العملية وكنت موجودة بالمنطقة المتضررة من الزلزال. شكرا كثير لكم وشكرا للانضمام. بيوم 7 شباط من العام الماضي أنا كنت بمنزلي بعنتابلي بجنوب تركيا ليلة حدوث الزلزال، وبالطبع الصدمة كانت كثير كبيرة، وحالة الهلع من الصعب وصفها لكارثة مدمرة مثل كارثة الزلزال. كان تأثيرها على سوريا أخذ شكل وطبقات متعددة بسبب الصعوبات يلي خلقها، إلى جانب العدد الكبير من الصعوبات الموجودة سابقا والعدد الكبير من الضحايا والمفقودين. فكان تدمير البنية التحتية والدمار الواسع بالأبنية والمدارس والمرافق الأخرى، واستمرار الهزات الارتدادية بالأسابيع الأولى، الأمر يلي أدى إلى نزوح عدد كبير من السكان يلي جزء منهم بالأساس كان نازح. النساء والأطفال يشكلون أغلبية السكان هناك، وهن كمان الفئة الأكثر هشاشة منه، وخصوصا بسياق شمال غرب سوريا بمكان تعيش فيه نساء كثر كربات أسر وراعيات لكبار السن وأطفال وباقي أفراد العائلة، وبوجود نسبة مرتفعة من ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة بالمنطقة، إضافة للعدد الكبير من النساء والأرامل وزوجات المفقودين، وهن من قبل الزلزال يعيشن معارك يومية لتوفير المأوى والرعاية لأسرهن اللي ممكن تكون بالأساس نازحة. مع الأخذ بعين الاعتبار أنه استمرارية النزوح وحالة عدم الاستقرار تزيد من مخاطر ومخاوف التعرض للعنف القائم على النوع الاجتماعي، بما فيه من استغلال واعتداءات وانتهاكات، وخصوصا بالأماكن المزدحمة والغير مستقرة والغير مهيئة بالشكل الكافي لضمان أمن وسلامة وخصوصية النساء والفتيات، إضافة لتعطيل خدمات الصحة بشكل عام وخدمات الصحة الإنجابية تحديداً، وتحول مختلف الأعمال والخدمات بشكل مباشر للبحث عن المفقودين وللعمليات الطبية الإسعافية. فكان لهي الكارثة أثر تراكمي للأعباء المترتبة على عاتق النساء، وهي جزء من الأسباب يلي حولت توجهنا كمؤسسة النساء الآن لنكون أكثر حساسية ووعي بحجم الضغط المترتب على النساء وازدياد الأعباء النفسية والمادية والاجتماعية، وإنه يكون تدخلنا لدعم صمود وقدرة النساء على الاستمرار بظل تحديات كبيرة بالمنطقة بشكل عام.
يا ماما بس بدنا تكوني شوي أبطأ مشان الترجمة من فضلك.
أنا عم أحكي بالعربي. أوكي. تمام. هلأ نحن بدأنا عملية الاستجابة كمان على 3 مراحل. الاستجابة كخطوة أولى كانت لدعم فريق المؤسسة المتواجد بشمال غرب سوريا وجنوب تركيا لتأمين إخلاءهم من المناطق الخطرة واللي كانت تشهد هزات ارتدادية متواصلة لأماكن أكثر أمن وسلامة، والاستجابة لاحتياجاتهم وتقديم الدعم المعنوي والمادي وخصوصا النفسي لجميع أعضاء الفريق وعائلاتهم ليقدروا هن بدورهم يكونوا فعالين كمان بالاستجابة لمجتمعهم المحيط. ومن هون كمان ضروري ننوه إنه فريق النساء الآن يعني 90% منه بالأساس نساء. بعد هاي المرحلة نحن اتجهنا للاستجابة لشركاتنا على الأرض للمبادرات المشاركة معنا بمشاريع معينة، لمجموعات العمل المختلفة، وأيضا عن طريق تقديم مختلف أشكال الدعم، ومنها الدعم النفسي والمادي والمساعدة بالإخلاء لأماكن أكثر أمن وسلامة. بالمرحلة الثالثة وهي مرحلة مستمرة إلى الآن معظم أنشطتها كانت الاستجابة للمجتمع المحلي بشمال غرب سوريا، وتحديداً عن طريق دعم النساء والفتيات بالمنطقة. بهاي المرحلة قمنا بعدد كبير من الأنشطة، منها توزيعات على نطاق واسع لتغطية الاحتياجات الأساسية للنساء والفتيات بمخيمات الشمال، واللي كان أكثرها مع الأسف مهمل ولا يؤخذ بعين الاعتبار عند القيام والتخطيط لأي عملية توزيع أخرى. قدرنا نأمن احتياجات نوعية للنساء ب 12 مخيم مختلف، واستفادت من هاي العملية أكثر من 2400 امرأة أو فتاة بالمخيمات. تخللها كمان مشاركة معلومات وخارطة خدمات وجلسات رفع وعي جماعية لقضايا جوهرية مثل الصحة النفسية وكيفية الوصول للخدمات المتاحة بالمنطقة. كمان خلال تنفيذ هاي العملية نحن كنا عم نراعي أعلى معايير الحساسية الجندرية والسياقية، فكان الفريق القائم على عملية المسح والتوزيع والتوثيق والتقييم هو من النساء بشكل كامل، وهذا لمسنا أثره الإيجابي بشكل كثير كبير لما كنا نعمل تقييم جودة لهاي الخدمة اللي عملناها. فكانوا النساء بالمخيمات يشعرون بالثقة وبالراحة للتعامل مع نساء أخريات كمقدمات خدمة ورعاية. بنفس هاي المرحلة نحن تعاوننا مع مبادرات نسائية محلية بشمال الغرب، وتحديدا 15 مبادرة اشتغلنا سويا نحن وهن بالاستجابة للمجتمع ولتعزيز أهمية ودور وقدرة النساء على أنه يكونوا فاعلات ومساهمات بشكل كبير وفعال بالاستجابة يعني لأزمة كبيرة مثل أو خلينا نقول يعني هي أزمات متراكمة، إجا الزلزال زادها أكثر، أثرت بشكل مباشر على مختلف جوانب حياتهم، بس ما منعتهم من أنه يكونوا من أكثر الناس فاعلية ويلعبوا دور حيوي بالاستجابة ودعم صمود المجتمع المحلي هناك. مع المبادرات نحن اشتغلنا 22 مشروع مختلف، وصلنا للفئات الأكثر تهميشاً يعني عن طريقهم، واستفدنا من الموارد المالية والبشرية وحتى الإرادة والرغبة القوية اللي موجودة عند المبادرات بأفضل شكل ممكن. وتعلمنا كثير منهم نحن كمؤسسة من عملهم وطريقة تدخل هاي المبادرات الصغيرة على الأرض، وبنفس الوقت اشتغلنا سويا نحن وهن لنطور الأدوات وشكل التدخلات وتحديدا شكل وعدد المساحات الآمنة والصديقة للنساء والفتيات لحتى يقدروا دائما يحصلوا على خدمات دعم نفسي وتمكين بمختلف جوانبه، وليضلوا بمركزية أي عملية استجابة أو تغيير على مستوى المنطقة. هلأ بالنهاية إذا كانت يعني الاستجابة الإنسانية تهدف بشكل أساسي لتلبية الاحتياجات الفورية والطارئة للمجتمعات المتضررة، فالتأثيرات المحددة على النساء خلتنا نشوف وسلطت الضوء على الحاجة إلى اتباع نهج يراعي الحساسية الجندرية بالاستجابة للكوارث، وكمان لضمان عملية التعافي منها. وبس يعني شكرا لك كثير زينة، ونرجع لعندك.
شكرا يا ماما على هذا الشرح المفصل. I will switch back to English. Since Yamama has already introduced the women initiatives that we are working with on the ground, I am going to introduce the women-led initiatives from Syria who have organized themselves to respond to the earthquake and delivered the real needs of women on the ground despite the difficult situations they face today. They continue to make changes in their communities. First is Dalal al-Bush, the founder of Zumurruda Center. She's from Jabal al-Zawiya and she is forcibly displaced now to Sal'in, to the city of Sal'in. دلال إذا أنت عم تسمعينا فبتمنى تتفضلي
مرحبا جميعا وشكرا لكم على الاستضافة. دلال بش مؤسسة مركز زمردة. رح أحكي عن تجربتي بكارثة الزلزال. كنا طالعين من كارثة التهجير القسري من جديد، يا دوب قدرانين نركز أمورنا المعيشية والسكن حديثا. صار الزلزال وطلعت أنا وعائلتي من تحت الأنقاض بفضل من الله، الحمد لله رب العالمين. كانت معنا حماتي كبيرة بالعمر وعاجزة ما بتقدر تمشي، وبناتي 3 صغار وأنا حامل. طلعنا بعد انتهاء الزلزال على جبل الزاوية يعني من بكير، هو بلدنا الأصلي. أما أنت على مدينة سلقين لحتى أقدر أكون مع النساء والأطفال، لأن هذا عمل إنساني وواجب إني أكون موجودة معهم. كان في مثل بينطبق علينا اللي هو بيقول ميت شايل ميت، لأنه فعلا كنا طالعين من الموت وطالعين لحتى نساعد الناس اللي هن تحت الأنقاض، عائلاتهم. يعني في نساء كتير كانت موجودة وعائلاتها كلها تحت الأنقاض. كان واجب إنساني علينا وعم بينادينا. كانت زميلتي بالفريق، وهي يعني بتخصني كتير. كان في زوجها وبناتها 3، الحمد لله رب العالمين. فقدتهم كلياتهم. ضلت هي وحامل بالشهر السابع ما يقارب 8 ساعات وهي تحت الأنقاض. الحمد لله قدر الله وما شاء فعل. وكتير من العائلات كانت مثلها، يعني ما كانت هي الوحيدة، كانت ريحة الموت معباي الدنيا. الحمد لله طلعنا بالاستجابة الطارئة عن طريق أصدقاء بمبالغ مالية، وكان في نحن عندنا مشغل خاص فينا، قدرنا كل شيء كان لباس جاهز خلال الفترة قبل الزلزال أخذناه وطلعنا نوزع على الأطفال والنساء اللي هن باركين في مخيمات، باركين في سكن جماعي، مراكز إيواء. بقينا نجمع تبرعات فردية ونساهم بالاستجابة لقدرنا نغطي أكبر عدد ممكن من النساء. في مسافة بين جبل الزاوية ومدينة سلقين ما يقارب 73 كيلو متر، وأنا حامل كل يوم روح وأرجع لعند عائلتي وأطفالي، وخايفة كتير كتير من الهزات اللي كانت ارتدادية على أطفالي وعلى نفسي. إني لما أطلع استودعا عند رب العالمين، خاف إني أنا ما أرجع وأنا بسلقين. سلقين كانت كلياتها يعني السكن فيها مضعضع، وكانت كل ما تصير هزة يعني انتوا كلكم عرفتوا انه تصير هدم بالبنايات. ضلينا على هذا الوضع الحمد لله لقدرنا نغطي أكبر عدد ممكن من النساء ومن الأطفال بكل شيء قدرنا نقدم لهم إياه. الكان بتبرعات يعني، والكان في لباس، والكان إنه نحن نوقف جنبهم ونعطيهم جلسات دعم نفسي. يعني حاولنا إنه نكون موجودين معهم خطوة بخطوة لحتى نقدر نساعد ونكون موجودين وثابتين وجودنا بالعمل الإنساني. شكرا كتير لكم.
شكرا كتير دلال، الحمد لله على سلامتكم وعلى سلامة الجميع، والله يرحم الناس اللي توفت بهي الكارثة. بتخيل إنه بالرغم من كل شيء العمل ضل مستمر، وهذا الشيء الفظيع، لأنه هذا الشغل اللي كان عم ينبنى صار له سنين قدر يتحول بلحظة لاستجابة لكارثة مثل هي كتير كانت هائلة. I will switch back to English again, and I will introduce Bisam. She is the responsible of one of the women-led initiatives, which we are also supporting in North Syria camps. So she's basically working with the camps. بيسان إذا عم تسمعيني لو سمحتي تفضلي. وعلى مهلك بدي أتمنى أنه نبطئ شوي مشان المترجمين يلحقوا معنا. بيسان عم تسمعينا؟ مشكلة دائما في صعوبات تقنية بالإنترنت مع سوريا. إذا عم تسمعينا أو قادرة تكتبي بيسان. طيب يبدو هلأ بنرجع بنتواصل مع بيسان ونشوف شو المشكلة التقنية. أكيد في شيء بالإنترنت. We will get back to Bisan once she has the technical issue solved. In the meantime, I would like to stress that the effort and significant work would not have been achieved without the solidarity and leadership of women who together built a community and shifted their daily activities to crisis response efforts based on community needs. Our partners at the Swedish Embassy in Beirut and Kvinna also have been throughout this journey with us since the beginning. Kvinna till Kvinna are our partners since almost the establishment of Women Now. I would like in this opportunity to give the floor to Evelina to share your experiences on this and your input as well.
Thank you so much, Saina. I will share some reflections on the excellent paper that we sent. That is the center of this discussion. But first of all, I also want to acknowledge the personal tragedies that are echoed throughout the reflection paper and throughout this conversation, and express my utmost sympathies for the unimaginable losses suffered and the hardships endured. It is heartbreaking to read and hear about the relentless commitments and efforts to aid the affected communities by people themselves just as affected. All part of the response deserve our utmost respect and support. As for my reflections on the paper and what we're discussing today, I want to again express how important it is that you have invested time and resources in documenting and sharing your experience of responding to the earthquake and past emergencies, as it contributes to the increasing evidence of the importance and efficiency of feminist crisis response and the recognition of feminist and grassroots organizations as humanitarian actors with the right to be represented and invested in. It also showcases how a feminist-driven response embodies a natural nexus approach when addressing immediate humanitarian needs, while holding long-term visions for women's rights, gender justice, and peace building at the response's core. Recognizing the role of women's rights and women's-led organizations and supporting their leadership promotes more efficient humanitarian action. It is the responsibility of donors and the humanitarian community to ensure accessibility of women's rights and women's-led organizations to international conversation, to invest in capacity building around longer-term and sustainable opportunities, and respect the authority and credibility of women's rights and women-led organizations. This includes long-term flexible funding modalities. I think we who represent the Swedish Development Corporation take great pride in being known as a flexible donor that encourages continuous adaptations to manage the complex and changing conditions in which all development actors operate. But when I read the report as a donor representative and practitioner, I felt very aware of the limits of our flexibility and the unwillingness or an inability to share more of the risk with our partners. I have own experience of managing a partnership and being asked for the possibility to share the risk if, due to the outburst of conflict, it wouldn't be possible to conduct normal financial reviews, and when our agency wasn't able to respond to this request in time for it to be relevant. Due to this experience, among others, when reading the paper, I reflected on how it probably would be easier for us as a government agency to grant the flexibility needed if or when a state of emergency rises, if being better prepared for such a scenario. Examples of this is to encourage and support partners operating in unstable environments to invest in organizational emergency preparedness and have a dialogue on how we as a donor and partner can support the execution of such a plan. Being a government agency, the exploration of how much we can bend the rules or just change internal practices takes a lot of time. Why it is crucial to have prepared for possible scenarios of immediate crisis beforehand. This would ensure that both we as a donor and our partners would have a mutual understanding of the possible freedoms and limitations when time is of essence. This is something I will bring back with me to my team and ensure that we implement in our current and future partnerships. I want to share two additional short reflections. The report highlights the importance of supporting Syrian feminist groups in exile as a necessary safeguarding of rights-based work. This, I believe, is important to emphasize, as I sometimes hear a discourse opposing human rights groups in Syria to those in exile. The report also clearly demonstrates how Women Now uses the fact that it constitutes of a split team as a strength, complementing and supporting each other to uphold a constant response. This support system is also clearly found in the regional and global feminist funding ecosystem, a value in itself that I think is often overlooked. And lastly, I really hope that care and investments in well-being will start being considered legitimate costs, essential in sustainable and effective human rights and humanitarian work. I will challenge my institutions and colleagues to recognize this in our partnerships, as well as scrutinize our own grant-making processes from a wellness perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelina. It is indeed great to listen to you. Elissa from Kvinna, I would also like to hear your input.
Yes, but I saw Bisan trying to talk, so I don't know if the mic with her is.
She could listen to us but she couldn't
عم
speak.
تسمعوني هيك؟
هلا عم نسمعك بيسان. تمام
Yeah.
ألو؟
تمام بيسان، نحن عم نسمعك.
أنا عم بسمع.
إذا قدرانة تسمعينا فيكي تحكي لأنه نحن عم نسمعك.
تمام. هيك تمام؟
تمام.
رح أحكي عن تجربتنا كمبادرة. بالأول اسمي بيسان، مسؤولة عن إحدى المبادرات في مخيمات الشمال السوري. رح أحكي كيف كان نزوح فوق نزوح، هيك كان وضعنا بعد كارثة الزلزال. طبعا بعد ما تمت الاستجابة للناس المتضررة للسكن بخيمة ضمن مخيم، إنه نحن شو رح نشتغل لنحصل على لقمة العيش. وبالأساس المخيم مخيم نزوح وبيضم كافة الفئات، وهو مؤلف في 40% نسبة ذوي الإعاقة، 40% و20% تحت خط الفقر. وفوق هيك لجأ 400 عائلة أو متضررة من الزلزال. فكان دورنا كمبادرة تقييم احتياج النساء واليافعات لمعرفة المطالب والمقترحات، وكانت الأولوية لنشاط مهنة الخياط لمعرفة يلي ضم 18 مستفيدة. تأثيرنا مو فقط كان إنه مساندة للتمكين الاقتصادي ورفع المستوى المعيشي، تأثيرنا كان نفسي. إحدى المستفيدات بإحدى زيارة للمركز قالت أنا ما عم صدق يجي الصبح لأجي على المركز وشوفكن، عم بحس كنت في سجن وطلعت منه. رغم إنه مساحتنا صغيرة، هي خيمة ضمن المخيم. قطعة القماشة يلي منحها الفريق لكل مستفيدة لتتعلم فيها، كان الهدف تتعلم بنفس الوقت هي تلبس الثوب الجديد، لأني كان جاي عيد. الزوجة يلي تمكنت من مهنة الخياطة وفورا اشتغلت فيها لتساعد زوجها يلي هو من ذوي الإعاقة وبيعاني من إنه يلاقي فرصة عمل لوضعه، فكانت زوجته هي المساندة له رغم الصعوبات يلي هي عم بتواجهها لعدم قدرتها على الحصول على ماكينة خياطة متطورة اللي تخدم فيها نفسها. طبعا أنا كنت بتمنى إنه المنحة تكون أكثر من هيك حتى إني أنا خدم هاي الحالات. طبعا من ضمن الاحتياج كان نشاط الحاسوب يلي ضم 25 مستفيدة ومنهم أعضاء فريقي يلي هو بحاجة ماسي للتطوير والتعليم بشكل دائم. الشيء الجميل هو إننا قدرنا بمبلغ بسيط وبتعاون تشبيك مع أحدى المبادرات بالمراكز المجاورة إني نقدم هيك خدمة هي بالأساس مكلفة عنا على الأرض. الحاسوب تكلفته كتير كبيرة. النساء ضمن مخيمات الشمال السوري هي بحاجة لمساحات آمنة يعني تمكن اقتصاديا واجتماعيا. بدي يعني بتمنى إنه الفرق التطوعية هي بحاجة لدعم مرن إنه طويل الأجل استدامي لنقدر نخدم هاي الأعداد من النساء ضمن طبعا المخيم اللي أنا فيه والمخيمات المجاورة. شكرا لكم.
شكرا بيسان، يعطيكم ألف عافية حبيبتي. رح انقل هلا، حجرب نكون مختصرين بالوقت لحتى نلحق كمان بنهاية الجلسة ناخد الأسئلة. فاللي عندهم أسئلة فيكم تكتبوا لنا على الشات بوكس. رح انتقل لعندك إليسا.
شكرا يا زينة. I will speak in English again. Bear with us. As well, I want to echo my fellow speakers in recognition of what Syrians yet again had to endure last year, and the intense experiences, reflections, feedback, and demands in the paper, whether by women or women-led initiatives. And also to share our respect for Women Now's powerful work contributing to such work and conversations. So I will reflect briefly on a couple of points, adding to what Evelina as well mentioned, especially on how the paper offers a space of genuine reflection, which is a much needed practice that we are lacking. And we could all use the space today to reflect on our ongoing practices. Because when operating in complex crisis, we may get stuck or get in survival mode. And so making space for reflection is in itself a form of resistance. In addition, I believe this paper emphasizes how feminist analysis and understanding of crisis in a conflict setting is critical to guide our strategies, our programs, our approaches and work, and from what was mentioned in terms of preparedness and not just responding to things when they happen. So for example, it resonates critical thinking with honesty, transparency, and sincerity to provide evidence and practice of the impact of feminist crisis response, especially in contexts where we as well are mentioning that more and more communities are increasingly vulnerable to compound crisis. I believe in the paper there's also a focus on building narrative by reclaiming and redefining terminologies through practice. For example, flexibility, localization, solidarity with local groups. And this reminds us how theory and practice cannot but come hand in hand. Most importantly, I think the paper demonstrates Women Now's and the initiatives, their partners, the response as a model that practices larger social values, which has been tapped into as well, such as dignity, agency, consent. And this is where women's rights organizations are key actors, taking crisis, conflict as opportunity for shifting perceptions. So this linked with the long-term change that we are all working towards. And this truly illustrates how self-led groups, they don't work on one issue as in one thematic. So they support their communities and what they need. They have holistic approaches. So it's important as well for donors to align with that as well and not focus on categorization or strict categorization that doesn't manifest reality. So thank you again for Women Now and the initiatives, Dalal and Bisan, and I'm sure there's a lot of amazing, strong women who have endured and proven yet again what is going on, and especially in this critical milestone in learning. As it's mentioned in the paper, it's not a celebration, it's a learning, and thus directing our commitment to those we work with. And so we continue to be committed to reflecting on our systems and practices to better address reality, to improve our support to Syrian women's rights organizations. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Elisa. Thanks to all who spoke today. I want also to just remind everyone that the response we have done at Women Now was not only with directly with the local communities, with the Syrian women initiatives, with the team in Turkey, but we also managed to make a campaign, advocacy campaign, which was called Earthquake Knows No Borders, and it was very well shared and recognized from the international media. And through this media efforts, we managed to tell the women's stories and to ask what they exactly need without even using a picture or any humiliating picture. We managed to respect all the women and the communities as human beings, and we share their stories and what they need with all respect. And I think we learned from this that we did this, yes, it was a response to the crisis, a sudden response, but it was also built on our all experiences and how we managed all the crises before and how we wanted to always reflect on women's violations. I am going to actually choose a few questions. We still have around 10 minutes. So I am going to, we have questions for Evelina actually. From Howard, our dear friend Howard Mollett from KFOD. He's sending these questions, 2 questions for Evelina. Firstly, could there be scope of Sweden to work with like-minded donors to press both UN agencies and INGOs and SNGOs on more robustly addressing gender sensitivity of their work in the longer-term preparations and longer-term programming?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I think that we do, and to what extent I'm not comfortable at responding, because I don't know actually, but I think that we do, and we often do that by sharing our practices and what we know. And the Swedish humanitarian assistance has clear stating on a requirement that all assistance must be at least gender responsive, but we also have an ambition for it to be as gender transformative as it could be. And I see this as a development going from not having this as a target to having much more clear target on being a gender transformative in the humanitarian response, from having a sense that all humanitarian assistance are neutral in sense, but it's not. And we are supported by dedicated people within our own organization that also supports program manager with method support, so they can have these conversation with the partners that we are supporting. And we often encourage like-minded donors and UN partners or INGOs. We challenge them on this, and we have our requirements when going into partnerships. And we do probably have a conversation with like-minded donors and share our practices, but exactly in what ways I cannot tell, because this is far from my daily work. But I really believe that we do. Sorry, Howard, for not having a more explicit answer. But also, I think that we can be challenged on this if there are arenas where it is felt that Sweden's voice is lacking. I think that we should be challenged on this.
Thank you, Evelina. I'm going to share one more question from Howard as well. If you can share any thoughts also for you, Evelina, on the research call for more of a risk-sharing approach between donors with WROs. Sweden clearly does provide flexible, adaptive funding to WROs. Can she share any advice about how to engage with other institutional donors on this? Could there be a scope for some kind of exchange between donors and on good practices in risk-sharing approach, for example?
I think that we are currently doing a lot of internal work to explore how much of the risk we actually can share. I think that we have had a rhetoric for long that we have a quite high risk appetite, and that we are willing to share risk to a higher degree than sometimes in practice we notice, such as myself, that we aren't that willing to actually share the risk when something happens. I myself have been disappointed many times in our internal procedures, not really letting us to share the risk. And I think that we have very rigid internal processes because we are a government agency. But we are many within the organization that are trying to challenge, because we also have a steering that directs us and direct the Swedish funding to locally led groups, to grassroots organizations, to individual activists being part of larger movements. And then I think that our normal partnerships or normal agreements, for example, doesn't really fit. So we really see internally that we need to challenge our routines so that we actually can share more of the risk. And I think that partly also we can address this by exploring these exploring what we think are risks. For example, in the report, it's clear that it can be challenging with the duty of care when something really happens, and I think that if we explore such a situation, what it means to practice the internal processes or internal policies, for example, on duty of care, it perhaps isn't a large of a risk, and we can be able to share it better if we are more prepared. And of course, I think that there is absolutely scope for exchange on this. But I think that internally we need to sort this out as a first step.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you, Evelina. I have a few more questions. I have a question for the Women Now team from Batul. Is it possible that there are initiatives to support marginalized women and women with disabilities?
فيني جاوب أنا هون زينة. أعتقد السؤال إذا نحن كنا اشتغلنا مع people with disability أو الأكثر تهميشا. هلا عن طريق المبادرات كان في مشاريع كثير مهمة صراحة للmarginalized والpeople with disability. إحدى المبادرات كان تدخلها لدعم النساء الحوامل خلال فترة الزلزال على سبيل المثال. مبادرة أخرى اشتغلت مع ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة وكبار السن لدعم احتياجاتهم اليومية والرعائية. مبادرة أخرى كان المشروع تبعهم والتدخل هو ليتعاملوا مع الوضع الطبي والصحي لضحايا متلازمة الهرس يلي صارت بعد الزلزال نتيجة يعني الدمار بالأبنية وسقوطها يعني فوق الناس. فكان في عدد من المبادرات بعضهم كان عندهم هاي التدخلات وراعوا كل جوانب واحتياجات الناس.
تمام يا ماما. صحيح الحكي. دلال، في عندك تعليق؟ رفعتي ايدك، في عندك تعليق؟ تفضلي. إذا عم تسمعينا دلال. طيب، أعتقد دلال ما عم تسمعنا هلأ، أو بجوز في مشكلة. I have one more question also from.
يعطيكم العافية.
تفضلي دلال، تفضلي.
أنا بس بدي كنت أحط يعني ملاحظة صغيرة. المنظمات الكبيرة الإنسانية هي ما بتقصر أبدا، بتكون موجودة بهذه الكارثات بالإنسان يعني.
الصوت عم يقطش دلال، ما عم نسمعك مع الأسف، ما في صوت. طيب أنا مضطرة رح نقول لآخر سؤال. دلال، إذا فيكي تكتبي لنا أنا بقرأ إذا مو شغال الصوت عندك، لأنه نحن ما عم نسمع. أوكي. So one more question to women.
مسموع صوتي؟
إيه، خلينا نجرب هلأ دلال مرة كمان، تفضلي.
يا ماما صبايا مسموع صوتي؟
مسموع.
تمام، يعطيكم العافية. أنا بس بدي أحط ملاحظة صغيرة. المنظمات الكبيرة كلياتها يعني هي عم بتقوم بواجبها، ولكن هي بتستنى أمر خارجي يعني من الداعم لها أنه انطلقي هلأ. نحن كفرق تطوعية بأي كارثة عم بتصير عم نقوم مباشرة تلقائيا بالعمل الإنساني بدون ما ننتظر أي أمر من أي حدا على أرض الواقع. يعني هاي الملاحظة بس حبيت أوضحها لكم، وشكرا كتير كتير لكم.
تمام دلال معك. شكرا للمداخلة. في عندي سؤالين، وبعدين بفضل إنه نختم الجلسة مع لبنى. لبنى رح أعطيكي أول سؤال من هاورد. رح أحكي إنجليزي. To what extent have you as women now been able to draw on your higher level human rights and women's rights policy dialogue to reinforce your feminist crisis response on the ground? Were you able to get human rights or women's rights actors to help press for change in policies and practices by the others involved in the humanitarian response or recovery work?
Thank you, Zena, and thank you, Howard, for this question. It's a big one, actually. I will try my best to respond to it. We are trying our best. We've been in every, I guess, conference or even talking about women's rights or feminist foreign policy with our other partner from feminist organization and our allies also from other organization to put pressure to at least adopt one human rights agenda toward what's happening in the world. Unfortunately, the scene now in the region, it's not the best. We know that there's double standards for human rights agenda. And we know that the interest in Syria and also the situation of women's rights and human rights in Syria is getting less and less, especially putting the light about what's happening in Gaza. So we are trying our best. We've got good luck sometimes. Most of the times, the world or the international atmosphere is not helping us. But what I can promise you that we will not keep silence. We are keep trying to make any effort and took any possible chance to advocate for women's and human rights in the area, and especially for feminist response. And now it may be the good chance to say that there is an upcoming feminist foreign policy will be in New Mexico. So we also will try our best to raise our voice there.
Thank you, Lubna. I am going to give you also, there is a question directly for you as a woman now. My question is about caring for the carers from Maxwell. Caring for the carers, can you elaborate on this? How was it done? It's a good question, actually.
Lubna, do you want me to take this, or Yamama, do you want me to take this one?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think there are three main ways that we found that this happened. So the first was the immediate, caring for the Women Now team and ensuring that their evacuation and their safety needs were taken care of, as well as the needs of their immediate family. So that was kind of phase one. The next way that this was built in was providing PSS support for everyone that was involved in the response, including women and families that received emergency kits in the displaced people's camp. So really building that in at all levels. And the other way that this happened was a little bit more organically, but it really spoke to the internal culture at Women Now, where people really reported the way that they checked in on each other, picked things up when they saw that people were overwhelmed. And so maybe that wasn't necessarily formally structured, but I think it really is a reflection on the internal culture at Women Now in terms of how that was done between people. But one thing I do just want to flag really quickly, and this is something we talked a lot about during the research, there were real monetary limits to what this care could look like. And I think an inequity that we discuss is that international aid workers who would have been responding to this crisis would have been paid exponentially more. And they also would have received mandatory contract breaks, right? So they would have had forced time off to rest, to see their family, to do something else. None of this was possible for the Women Now teams or the women-led initiatives who, as Dalal just said so powerfully, carried out their initiatives without waiting for a green light, right? They went right to action. And I think that's something we really have to think about in how we resource this work, because that inequity in pay, but also built-in infrastructure around taking a break is something we really need to think about in how we structure and fund this work, because yeah, that was really present in our conversation.
Thank you, Cassie. That's great. Actually, we have come to the end of our session. I would like to thank you all, to all the teams behind this screen, to everyone who was putting any effort, no matter how small, to make this feminist crisis response a lesson to learn from and to assist each other and other women. Lubna, I will give you the floor for final remarks on this session, and thank you all. You are mute, Lubna.
Thank you, Zaina. I will make it really very quick. I just want to encourage everyone to read the paper. There is a lot of finding that we could include, and as you see, we are a key actor, and we want to keep doing what we are doing. So we need all the support that is available, and also to put more effort to support women-led groups with the shrinking of the fund and the interest in Syria. I want to say thank you to Batul Al-Aita, our meal manager, who's on maternity leave now. She played a very big and important role in shaping the paper. And also, I want to thank our partner and donor that they hurry up to really support us in our feminist response. And all this work wouldn't happen without their effort. Also, I want to extend this thank to WILF, to Urgent Action Fund, to Global Fund for Women, to Kvinna Kvinna, BACS, Women for Women, Foundation de France, the Equality Fund, K-Food, 1111, Madre, and Choose Love. Thank you for all of you. And I hope that we continue all this effort to support women's rights in the area without any more crisis or disaster. Thank you for your time and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Really, thank you, everyone.